Winter approaches slowly, like a silent predator, and each passing day seems to steal a piece of Leningrad's soul. The city, one of the proudest in the Soviet Union, now breathes like a wounded man, struggling to stay afloat as the German shadow tightens around it. Since the end of summer, the Wehrmacht had been building a steel ring around the city. It wasn't just a military siege, it was a planned, calculated, cold strangulation. The Germans knew that if they couldn't conquer Leningrad quickly, they would simply have to let it bleed and freeze to death, and that's exactly what they began to do. Inside the city, the once noisy streets had become silent corridors, broken only by the distant echo of bombings, or the mournful creaking of an improvised sled pulled by someone carrying firewood, or a body. Food had disappeared. The electricity failed. People ripped wood from furniture, doors, fences, anything that could generate heat for 5 minutes. Entire families huddled in dark rooms, dividing crumbs of stale bread as if they were treasures. Children, thin as shadows, walked along the frozen sidewalks, not understanding why the world around them was dying so quickly. Meanwhile, outside, German troops tightened their grip like a snake constricting its prey. Fortified lines sprang up in every direction, trenches, barbed wire, machine gun nests. Each passing day made the enemy wall thicker, more lethal, more impossible to breach. The Soviets inside the city knew that resisting was a matter of honor, but also of desperation. Winter would turn Leningrad into an icy tomb if the Red Army didn't open a corridor. There was no middle ground. Either the siege would be broken or Leningrad would cease to exist. And that certainty hung over every soldier, every civilian, every general. People looked at the cold, white horizon and knew time is running out. The city is dying, and everyone feels it. If nothing is done, Leningrad will be swallowed up by hunger, cold, and final silence. While Leningrad lay dying in Moscow, the tension was almost palpable. Reports arrived on Stalin's desk every day. Pages and pages describing famine, disease, constant bombing, and thousands of silent deaths within the besieged city. And despite his hard and impenetrable demeanor, there was something Stalin understood very well. If Leningrad were to fall, it would be a mortal blow, not only militarily, but morally, for the entire Soviet Union. The city carried centuries of history. It was the window to the West, a symbol of Russian culture, home to poets, scientists, workers, and soldiers. Losing Leningrad would mean allowing Hitler to destroy one of the nation's jewels, and that Stalin simply could not accept. The military commanders presented alternatives, maps, routes, each marked by absurd risks. Breaking the encirclement meant confronting some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced defenses, equipped with precise weapons, deep trenches, and elevated positions. And on top of all that, there was the cold, the enemy that never sleeps. Even so, Stalin does not hesitate. He utters a phrase that echoes like a sentence: "The siege must be broken at any cost." The meeting falls silent. Everyone understands the weight of those words. From that moment on, a race against time begins. Generals are urgently summoned. Troops are hastily assembled, many too young, others too old, some without adequate training, but all carrying the same impossible mission: to march against German fortifications and open a corridor to Leningrad. Within days, columns of soldiers begin to move toward the swamps and forests south of Lake Ladoga. They carry rifles, grenades, hope, and fear. Many wear worn boots, tattered coats, and battered helmets. But they don't complain. They can't complain. The order came from above, and his city, his Leningrad, depends on them. As these men move forward, the feeling that accompanies each step is the same. They are walking directly into a steel and ice furnace. Meanwhile, Stalin watches from afar, knowing that thousands will die, but believing that the only chance to save the city is to sacrifice everything necessary. Thus, Operation Sinyavino was born, not as a choice, but as a desperate obligation. The hope of breaking the siege now rests on the shoulders of men who don't even know what awaits them. When the Soviet generals finally gather their maps around an improvised table, the decision is made with knife-edge precision. The main attack will be against the hills of Sinyavino. Sinyavino was not just a point on the map. It was a high line of firm ground, surrounded by dense forests and treacherous swamps. A high position that allowed the Germans to see for miles around, like eagle eyes watching any Soviet movement. Controlling Sinyavino meant controlling the fate of the corridor that would lead to Leningrad. And the Germans knew this. That's why they transformed the hills into fortresses that are almost impossible to breach. Deep trenches snaked across the hillside like dark scars. Machine gun positions were buried and camouflaged among tree trunks. Anti-tank guns lay hidden beneath pine netting. And above all, the German troops defending the site were experienced. Veterans who had survived other Soviet offensives and had no intention of giving ground. For the Soviets, attacking Sinyavino was like trying to climb a mountain made of iron. But there was no alternative. A frontal assault was the only way to break the siege before Leningrad succumbed to famine. While the commanders explained the plan, many soldiers remained silent, simply listening. They looked at the map and saw much more than just lines and symbols. They could see their destiny. They saw frozen swamps that would swallow whole men. They saw minefields that didn't appear on paper. They traveled through forests where every tree could conceal a sniper. But they also saw something bigger: Leningrad, their families, the friends who were still breathing inside the besieged city. And that was what made each soldier clench his fist tightly, even knowing they were being sent to one of the most dangerous terrains on the entire Eastern Front. None of them retreated. In the icy dawn before the attack, entire units lined up silently before the vast white expanse that separated them from the Sinyavino hills. The wind howled through the trees, raising snow in spirals that seemed like whispers of warning, but no one reversed their decision. The objective was clear: take Sinyavino, break through the siege, save Leningrad, or die trying. From that moment on, the nightmare was officially about to begin. When the signal to advance was finally given, the Soviet troops did not march on roads or across firm ground. They were pushed directly into one of the most treacherous regions of the entire front, the frozen swamps around Sinyavino. During the summer, that terrain was a sea of thick mud, capable of swallowing horses, cars, and even trucks. In winter, it transformed into something even worse, a mixture of thin ice, brittle slabs, and hardened mud that seemed alive, waiting for the first wrong step to pull someone down. The soldiers advanced cautiously, but the cold made everything more difficult. Each breath released a white cloud that dissolved into thin air. Each step elicited a dry sound, like cracking wood. And worst of all, no one knew exactly where the ice might give way. The first to fall was a young recruit, perhaps 18 years old. He took a step to the right, and the ground simply vanished. The icy water swallowed his legs, and then his entire body. His screams mingled with the wind. His companions tried to reach him, but the ice broke even more. In seconds, the young man disappeared into the frozen darkness. And the march continued. There was no time for lamenting. Some soldiers tried tying logs or pieces of wood to their feet to distribute the weight, but this only slowed them down. Others continued dragging their own bodies along the ground, as if crawling were less deadly than walking. The soaked boots quickly began to freeze on their feet. Men felt the tips of their fingers stiffening, losing feeling. One officer tried to warm his hands with his breath, but they were so rigid he could barely close them. The cold didn't just punish, it tormented. He was gnawing on the bones. And every minute, while the Soviets struggled to stay afloat in that icy inferno, the Germans watched from their elevated positions. They knew they didn't need to expend ammunition at that moment. Nature was already doing the dirty work. Even so, the Soviet columns kept advancing, because they knew that falling behind meant freezing, and moving forward meant, at the very least, trying to live. When they finally reached firm ground on the other side of the swamps, the soldiers were exhausted, trembling, many unable to feel their feet. Some carried unconscious comrades on their shoulders, others dragged silent, rifles, heavy as stones. But they all had the same feeling when they looked into the distance and saw the Sinyavino hills emerging from the white mist. If that was only the beginning, what awaited them ahead would be 10 times worse. Sinyavino's nightmare had barely begun, and it was already taking its toll in blood and ice. The attack begins before dawn, when the sky is still a dirty, heavy grey, as if the day itself were afraid to break. A brief Soviet bombardment cuts through the silence. Cannons fire, the earth trembles, trees explode into splinters. For a few minutes, the soldiers believe that perhaps, just perhaps, that has broken through the German defenses. Then comes the order: move forward. Men leave the shallow shelter of the forests and run towards the hills of Sinyavino. The terrain ahead is a cruel mixture of frozen clay, ice-filled craters, and trampled snow. Every step is unsteady. Every run seems endless. And then all hell breaks loose. German machine guns spring into action almost simultaneously, spitting out long, precise bursts. The sound is dry, continuous, mechanical. Soviet soldiers fall before they even understand where the shots are coming from. Some stumble, others throw themselves to the ground, trying to disappear into shallow craters that offer little protection. Grenades explode in the middle of the formations. The impact throws men into the air, mixing earth, snow, and blood in a single whirlwind. Screams echo, some of pain, others of fear, others simply of surprise. Officers try to shout orders, but their voices are lost in the chaos. Still, the attack doesn't stop. Groups leap forward, running from crater to crater. One soldier pulls his wounded comrade by his coat, leaving a dark trail in the snow. Another fires his rifle until the bolt jams from the cold. He tries to unlock it with thick gloves, fails, and continues advancing nonetheless. The Germans, protected in well-constructed trenches, observe everything coldly. They have been waiting for this moment. Every firing line has been calculated. Every Soviet advance lands exactly where they want it. The floor, once white, begins to change color. Within minutes, the initial attack loses momentum. Motionless bodies mark the path taken. But what is most striking is not how many have fallen, it's how many continue to advance. Even seeing what lies ahead, the Soviet soldiers press on, driven by something greater than fear, the certainty that, if they fail there, Leningrad will continue to die behind them. When the first assault finally ends, the battlefield is shrouded in low smoke and silence broken only by isolated gunshots and distant groans. No hill has been taken, no decisive position has fallen. The first attack failed, but everyone knows, Soviets and Germans alike, that this was only the beginning. Sinyavino's real nightmare is far from over. The Germans don't panic. They never do. This is a truth forged in the fire of ancient battles, from the muddy trenches of the Great War to the frozen plains of the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht rose like an inexorable machine of precision and determination. In Sinyavino, in the autumn of 1942, during the Soviet offensive aimed at breaking the siege of Leningrad, that besieged city where more than 1 million civilians had already perished from hunger, cold, and incessant bombing, the German defenders of the 18th Army, under the command of General Georg Lindemann, watched the horizon with a calmness bordering on the supernatural. Their eyes, hardened by years of lightning-fast conquests in Poland, France, and the Russian steppes, did not blink at the unfolding chaos. For them, the roar of Soviet T-34 tanks and the thunder of Red Army boots were no surprises. They were merely chapters outlined in a war manual that they themselves had written. As soon as the initial momentum of the Soviet attack, launched by the 55th Army and the 8th Army of the Leningrad front, with over 200,000 men rushing, against the German lines in a desperate attempt to link up with besieged forces, began to falter under the weight of anti-personnel mines and machine gun fire. German officers were already positioned in their reinforced bunkers, Zeiss binoculars pressed against their eyes, mapping every enemy movement with the coldness of surgeons dissecting a body. They knew the Red Army was coming. Intelligence reports, captured from Soviet prisoners tortured in nighttime interrogations, had revealed Zhukov and Meretskov's plans weeks earlier. The Germans, with their veteran divisions like the 223rd Infantry and the 28th Jaeger, were ready not only to resist, but to crush, to turn the Soviet advance into a lesson in carnage that would echo through the annals of military history. Swift orders, transmitted via buried telephone wires and messengers on BMW motorcycles that cut through the snowy terrain like fleeting shadows, traversed the defensive lines with the efficiency of a Swiss watch. Reserve units, comprised of soldiers who had fought in Demyansk, where they withstood a Soviet siege for months, surviving temperatures of 40 degrees Celsius and meager rations, moved with almost mechanical precision, emerging from underground shelters dug with shovels and pickaxes during endless nights. These men, many of them recruits from Bavaria or East Prussia, left behind the relative comforts of extinguished campfires and lice-infested blankets to occupy key positions, deep trenches, reinforced with felled pine logs and frozen sandbags, adjusting firing ranges with rulers and compasses, preparing 81mm mortars and Park 38 anti-tank guns, whose projectiles could pierce Soviet armor like hot knives through ice. While the exhausted and bloodied Soviets struggled to recover on the open ground, a vast swamp of melted snow and sticky mud, where the bodies of comrades lie twisted in grotesque poses, glazed eyes fixed on the grey sky, hell truly begins, a meticulously orchestrated hell that transforms the landscape into a slaughterhouse. German artillery, composed of 105 and 150 howitzer batteries, goes into action with brutal efficiency. Shots calculated by forward observers who adjust coordinates with millimeter precision. Shells fall at a steady pace, like raindrops in an inevitable storm, exploding among craters already filled with wounded men who scream for mercy in guttural Russian, their shattered limbs mingling with the earth. Men who had miraculously survived. The machine guns are now torn apart by invisible shrapnel, fragments of metal that fly like enraged bees, severing arteries and pulverizing bones indiscriminately. There is no safe haven. The very earth, treacherous and merciless, seems to conspire against them, opening into funnels of death where pools of blood freeze instantly, trapping boots and bodies in an icy prison. On the Sinyavino Hills, strategic elevations dominating the battlefield, captured by the Germans in September 1941 during the initial offensive against Leningrad, are now fortified with machine gun nests and S-mines that would leap into the air when stepped on. MG-34s and MG-42s are repositioned by teams of 2 or 3 men, their calloused hands adjusting rusty tripods. Their shots don't come in uncontrolled bursts like those of the inexperienced Soviets, but in deadly lines, sweeping across the terrain like invisible steel scythes, cutting through entire ranks of attackers before they could raise their Mosin Nagant rifles. Each Soviet advance, driven by political commissars, brandishing Tokarev pistols and shouting Stalin's slogans about the great patriotic war, is cut short before it even takes shape, leaving behind piles of brown uniforms stained red, where widows in Moscow and Leningrad would never know the fate of their husbands. Small German groups trained in the blitzkrieg infiltration doctrine that had conquered half of Europe launched swift and violent counterattacks, emerging from the white fog, a dense mist formed by the collective breathing of thousands of men and the vapor of explosions, like vengeful ghosts. They attack with rod grenades that explode into shrapnel confetti and concentrated MP40 fire, whose rhythmic clicks echo like demonic laughter, before disappearing again among the skeletal trees of the Sinyavino forest. They don't try to recover everything at once. Their strategy is to bleed the enemy dry, little by little, like a predator that bites and retreats, leaving its prey to weaken in prolonged agony. These counterattacks, inspired by Rommel's tactics in North Africa but adapted to the frozen hell of Russia, sow terror. Soviets see comrades evaporate in clouds of blood, never catching a glimpse of the sniper. For the Soviets in the field, the feeling is suffocating, a cloak of despair tightening around their chests like the claws of the Russian winter. They don't see a mass enemy, organized in visible lines. They see only death surging from all sides, unpredictable and omnipresent, like an angry god punishing their audacity. Messengers, young recruits from collective farms in Ukraine, try to run between units, carrying orders scribbled on soaked papers, but many don't reach their destination, hit by Scharfschützen snipers with Kar-98K rifles equipped with telescopic sights, their bodies falling like severed puppets. Radios fail under the weight of the dampness and cold, batteries freezing in useless blocks, leaving commanders isolated in bubbles of ignorance. Command fragments. One battalion advances blindly, while another retreats in panic, men fighting and dying without knowing if the attack continues or if it has already been called off by distant generals in heated bunkers. And above all, there is the constant sound, bone-shaking explosions, bursts of gunfire that pierce eardrums, screams of agony mingling with the howling wind, and then silence, a silence broken only by the cold wind passing over motionless bodies, carrying the metallic stench of blood and exposed entrails. This silence is not one of relief, it is the prelude to more horror, a void that amplifies the terror of solitude amidst the carnage. The German reaction makes something terrible clear, a truth that hangs over the field like a toxic cloud. Sinyavino will not be taken easily. Every meter of ground gained, those precious kilometers that could break the siege of Leningrad, where civilians devoured cooked leather and rats to survive, will be contested. With steel, fire and blood, a tribute demanded by the defenders who see their position not as a mere line on the map, but as the pivot of the entire northern front. The Germans are not just defending a position, they are defending the siege of Leningrad itself, Hitler's dream of strangling the birthplace of the Bolshevik Revolution. And they know that if they fail there, the entire northern front could collapse, opening the way for a Soviet counterattack that could reverse the course of the war. As night begins to fall, with the setting sun tinging the snow with a prophetic red, the Soviets realize the day's bitterest truth. The enemy has not only resisted, but is now taking control of the battle's rhythm, dictating the terms like a somber maestro, conducting a symphony of destruction. And this means only one thing: the next attack will be even more deadly, an escalation of terror where hope dissolves in the frigid air, leaving only the raw despair of men condemned to dance with death under the impassive gaze of the stars. There is no rest, there is no true silence. In the heart of the Sinyavino Offensive, where the Red Army, driven by Stalinist determination to alleviate the suffering of Leningrad, a city that, since September 1941, had endured a siege that killed thousands a day, with whispered reports of cannibalism in deserted streets, was attempting to reorganize its fragmented forces. The sky seemed to collapse over the hills like the Last Judgment. German artillery, fed by supplies arriving by rail from Riga and Tallinn, increased the pace with calculated fury, transforming the battlefield into a vortex of flames and fragments that devoured everything in its path. These are not isolated, erratic shots like those of nervous recruits. It is a continuous storm, orchestrated by artillery officers who, with detailed topographical maps and refined ballistic calculations from the Potsdam military academies, calibrate each salvo to break not only bodies, but wills. crushing the human spirit under the inexorable weight of metal. The shells fall in rhythmic waves, exploding the frozen ground as if it were glass shattered by a divine hammer, launching fragments of ice, stones and metal that cut flesh without warning, tearing uniforms and skin with the indifference of a force of nature. Each impact echoes like a primordial thunderclap, shaking the earth and sending shockwaves that make teeth grind and hearts fail, while the air fills with an acrid dust that suffocates lungs, already weakened by the Siberian cold. The battlefield transforms into something unrecognizable, a Dantean nightmare that would make the veterans of Verdun pale. Where once there were forests of tall pines, silent witnesses to centuries of Russian history, now only broken trunks remain, pointing to the sky like the mutilated fingers of fallen giants, their charred bark smoldering in the frigid air. The white snow, once pure as the innocence of a nation at war, disappears under a dark mud, mixed with blood, entrails, and pieces of destroyed equipment, twisted rifles, perforated helmets, torn backpacks scattering unread love letters. The smell of gunpowder is so strong it burns the lungs, mingling with the fetid odor of burnt flesh and excrement released in moments of absolute terror, creating an atmosphere that corrodes sanity like acid. The Soviets responded with a desperate fury, born from the resilience of a people who had endured the purges of 1937 and the Nazi invasion of 1941. 152 Minitus cannons and Katyushas, the famous Stalin's organs that launched rockets in howling salvos, fired relentlessly, entire batteries pouring ammunition against the hills in an attempt to silence enemy positions. But the high ground, a geographical advantage the Germans had exploited since the Battle of Tannenberg in 1914, favored the defenders. Many Soviet shells exploded below the reinforced trenches, raising columns of black smoke that obscured vision without, causing the expected damage, leaving the Germans unscathed to continue their symphony of destruction. In the midst of this inferno, men go mad, their minds fracturing like the ground beneath the bombardment. Soldiers cower at the bottom of jagged craters, covering their heads with trembling hands, murmuring the names of mothers, wives and children left behind in remote villages of Siberia or Ukraine. Visions of warm homes dissolving into feverish delirium. Others, driven by primal panic, try to run through the crossfire, only to be ripped from the ground by explosions that leave no time for screams. Bodies disintegrating into red mists, pulverized bones mingling with the snow. There are wounded men calling for help in hoarse voices, extending mutilated arms, but no one can leave the shelter. Raising one's head is inviting death, an immediate sentence delivered by shrapnel or bullets that buzz like deadly insects. The cold continues its silent work, an invisible ally of the Germans, amplifying the terror with its inexorable slowness. Spilled blood freezes quickly, clinging to uniforms like icy glue, transforming wounds into black tumors of necrotic tissue. A man wounded in the leg tries to crawl backward, his nails breaking on the hard ground, but his fingers no longer respond, numb from the hypothermia that creeps like a venomous snake. The body is alive, the heart still beats in panic, but it is already losing the war against the ice, a slow death where despair deepens. With each shallow breath, visions of family fading into a white void, communications practically disappear, swallowed by the reigning chaos. Officers, many of them survivors of the Battle of Moscow in 1941, shout orders that no one hears, their voices drowned out by the constant roar of explosions. Battalions fight like isolated islands in a sea of fire, unaware of what is happening just meters away. One platoon advances while another is annihilated, creating pockets of madness where allies are, confused with enemies in the fog. The chaos is total, an anarchy that devours hierarchies and plans, leaving men at the mercy of primitive instincts, survive or die trying. And yet, some continue to advance, anonymous heroes driven by a mixture of communist indoctrination and human desperation. Small Soviet groups rise amidst the firestorm and rush toward German positions, almost like shadows dancing on an infernal stage, their fixed bayonets gleaming under flashes of explosions. Many are hit. Before they reach, bodies falling in piles that serve as makeshift shields for those who follow. Some manage to reach enemy lines, leaping into trenches with activated grenades, causing brutal explosions in confined spaces, limbs flying, muffled screams echoing in guttural murmurs. But each success is short-lived, a fleeting spark in an eternal night. Each victory costs dozens of lives, leaving widows and orphans in a homeland that glorifies sacrifice but ignores grief. When the dam finally recedes, after hours that seem like eternities, the silence that follows is even more terrifying, a vacuum that amplifies the latent terror. It is not a silence of peace, but the silence of a devastated field, covered in bodies that no longer move, where the wind howls like lost souls, carrying whispers of unanswered agony. The survivors look around, glazed eyes fixed on faces blackened by soot, and understand something terrible. Neither side yielded. The firestorm did not decide the battle. It only prepared the ground for something even more cruel, an escalation of horror where fear intertwines with hopelessness and terror becomes a constant companion. Because now, after the steel and explosions that shook the earth like earthquakes, will come the closest, most intimate, most bloody fight. Hand-to-hand combat, where bayonets pierce flesh, hands strangle throats, and a man's last breath mingles with his killer's first, in an endless cycle of violence that devours souls and leaves only empty shells under the merciless Russian sky. When the infantry is already exhausted, their bodies dragged down by the weight of soaked backpacks and rusty rifles, and the field seems to swallow men endlessly, like a voracious mouth of mud and snow that devours entire souls without ever being satiated. The last visible hope of the Soviets emerges: the tanks. At the heart of the Sinyavino Offensive, launched in August 1942 by the Red Army under General Leonid Govorov, with the desperate goal of breaking the German siege of Leningrad, that agonizing metropolis where, after more than a year of blockade, entire families perished in freezing apartments, devouring wallpaper mixed with glue to stave off agonizing hunger. Armored vehicles represented not only war machines, but symbols of redemption, promises of Soviet industrial power forged in the foundries of Kharkov and Stalingrad, where exhausted workers toiled endless shifts under the Stalinist yoke to produce these steel beasts that had shocked the world at the Battle of Kursk and on other fronts. The sound arrives before them, a deep, metallic roar that grows in the white mist like an omen of primal fury, echoing through the hills like the thunder of angry gods. V2 diesel engines forced by the biting cold, temperatures plunging below zero, freezing oils and fuel into viscous masses that threaten to seize the gears, fight to stay afloat, coughing up black smoke that mingled with the collective breath vapor of thousands of soldiers. Then, slowly, the silhouettes appear, T-34s advancing in irregular formation, covered in snow piled up like white shrouds, sticky mud clinging to screeching tracks, and shrapnel marks from previous battles, scars of twisted metal that told stories of ambushes at Smolensk or on the Ukrainian steppes. For many foot soldiers, peasant recruits from the vast plains of central Russia, torn from their kolkhozes by ruthless commissars, poorly trained and equipped with tattered uniforms that barely protected them from the Siberian wind. That sight rekindled something forgotten for days. Hope, a fleeting glimpse that the tide of war could turn, that Soviet steel, designed by engineers like Mikhail Koshkin amidst the purges of 1937, could crush the German arrogance that had conquered Paris in weeks. The tanks advanced like primordial steel monsters, bursting from the forest edges with an earth-shaking roar, crushing barbed wire stretched like deadly spiderwebs, broken trunks of Centuries-old pine trees that had witnessed Napoleonic invasions, and even frozen bodies on the ground, comrades fallen hours before, their pale faces fixed in expressions of eternal agony, limbs stiff as dry branches. Their 76mm guns fire at the Sinyavino Hills, those treacherous elevations defended by the German 170th Infantry Division and elements of the 11th Panzer Division, making trenches explode in clouds of frozen earth and acrid smoke, sending fragments of wood and concrete flying like divine shrapnel. For a few minutes, it seems that the balance of battle is shifting. The Soviets, driven by Zhukov's doctrine of mass attacks, see German positions falter, machine gun nests silenced, and a path opening up toward Lake Ladoga, where supplies could finally flow into the starving city. But the terrain is unforgiving, a living, hostile entity shaped by centuries of merciless Russian winters that had swallowed entire armies since the time of Peter the Great. The frozen ground is not as solid as it seems. Beneath the hard layer, hardened by night frosts that turn puddles into sheets of ice, lies deep mud, holes camouflaged by soft snow, roots intertwined like natural traps, and brittle ice that shattered under the weight of 30 tons. One of the T-34s, commanded by a veteran lieutenant from Kursk, tilts too far as it passes over a hidden crater formed by a German shell hours earlier. The tracks spin in vain, skidding in the slippery mud, the engine roaring in protest as the vehicle sinks like a ship in a stormy sea. Another tries to go around it, maneuvering with desperate precision, but it too gets stuck, its gears grinding against the treacherous earth, leaving the crew exposed like trapped prey. And the Germans had been expecting it. Their defensive doctrine, perfected in the battles of El Alamein and the plains of Belarus, anticipated precisely this vulnerability. PaK-40 anti-tank guns, camouflaged in elevated positions with snow nets and branches, opened fire. Almost immediately, dry shots cutting through the air with a sharp whistle, hitting the flanks of the tanks, where the once revolutionary sloped armor now proved insufficient against tungsten ammunition. A T-34 was pierced with a metallic roar that echoed like a funeral bell. Flames escaped from the hatches, licking the icy air, while the diesel fuel ignited in an orange fireball. The crew, driver, gunner, loader, all young men from Leningrad who dreamed of the end of the siege, tried to escape, scalding themselves on superheated metal, but the fire and smoke engulfed everything in seconds, stifling screams in a suffocating silence. When the hatches finally open, creaking in agony, no one emerges alive. Only charred, unrecognizable bodies fall out like burnt wood. German machine guns, the ubiquitous MG-42s, with their infernal rate of fire of 1,200 rounds per minute, turn against the infantry following the tanks, now without cover, exposed like lambs to the slaughter. Men fall trying to hide behind steel hulls that no longer move, bullets ricocheting off armor with sparks, piercing legs and torsos in a macabre dance. What was an advance becomes a trap. An improvised cemetery where dreams of victory dissolve into pools of blood that freeze instantly, sticking boots together in a frozen prison of terror. Even so, some tanks continue, mechanical heroes in a saga of despair. A T-34 advances alone, its commander shouting orders through a crackling intercom, firing in all directions. With bursts that pulverize trees and enemy positions, crushing a German position, a log bunker where Wehrmacht soldiers took shelter, before being hit by several shots almost simultaneously, projectiles converging like a collective judgment. It stops abruptly, black smoke rising slowly from the damaged engine as if breathing its last, a dying giant falling silently onto the snowy field. For Soviet soldiers, the scene is devastating. A blow to the collective heart that transforms optimism into an abyss of despair. What should have paved the way, The T-34s, symbols of Soviet resilience that had turned the tide in Moscow, now becomes monuments of burnt steel, scattered across the field like relics of a lost era, their motionless turrets pointing to the grey sky in silent accusation. Each destroyed tank takes with it experienced men, difficult to replace in an army that was losing thousands a day, and a piece of collective hope, leaving behind widows in remote villages who would never receive news, only cold telegrams announcing missing in action. When the armored offensive loses momentum, with the last engines falling silent in a final groan, silence returns for a few moments, broken only by the crackling of distant flames and the wind howling like a lament. The tanks that survived retreat slowly, tracks screeching in humiliating retreat, while those left behind remain motionless, frozen on the battlefield like giant tombs, covered by a layer of frost that transforms them into statues of failure. It becomes clear to everyone, in a moment of terrifying clarity, not even steel alone can conquer Sinyavino, a cursed land where nature conspires with the enemy, devouring machines and men with equal indifference. And as the smoke dissipates in the icy air, carrying the acrid smell of burnt metal and charred flesh, the soldiers realize that the battle is about to change form, descending into an even darker abyss. Now, the fight will be even closer, among trees that whisper secrets of death, among shadows that swallow sanity, among men who no longer expect mercy, only the final embrace of darkness. With tanks destroyed or immobilized, their smoldering carcasses serving as funeral markers in the open field, and artillery unable to decide the battle, salutes of Soviet Katyushas and German howitzers exchanging fire in an endless duel that only multiplied craters without breaking lines. The conflict spills into the forests around Sinyavino, those dense thickets of pine and birch that had sheltered Russian partisans since the Mongol invasion, now transformed into labyrinths of terror, where war loses any trace of order, dissolving into a primal chaos of instinctive survival. There, in the autumn of 1942, during the operation aimed at uniting the Volkhov and Leningrad fronts, under the command of generals like Kirill Meretskov, who had survived the Stalinist purges to lead suicidal attacks, the combat becomes a macabre dance among shadows, where humanity disintegrates into bestial impulses to kill or be killed. Visibility is minimal, an opaque veil that transforms allies into ghosts and enemies into invisible demons. Smoke from grenades and fires mixes with the white fog that hangs like a shroud, with the vapor of men's breath, hot breaths that freeze in the air, forming crystals that fall like icy tears. A few meters away, it is no longer possible to distinguish friend from foe. Soviet brown uniforms and German grey uniforms merge into the twilight, SSH-40 and Stahlhelm helmets blurring into vague silhouettes. The sound of gunfire echoes among the trees, distorted by the echo of damp bark, coming from all directions at once, creating a symphony of paranoia where every crack of a dry branch could be the prelude to an ambush. Soviet soldiers advance in small groups, crawling through the dirty snow that clings to their knees and elbows, hiding behind tree trunks shattered by shrapnel, moving from tree to tree with their hearts in their throats, each breath a risk of being heard. On the other side, the Germans, veterans of the 223rd Infantry Division, hardened by campaigns in Norway and France, now adapting guerrilla tactics learned in the forests of East Prussia, do the same, moving like native predators, camouflaged with branches and snow that make them part of the hostile landscape. Each step could be their last, a game of Russian roulette, where the treacherous ground hides shoe mines that explode when stepped on, launching shrapnel that maims without immediately killing, leaving victims screaming in prolonged agony. And then the inevitable happens, a climax of horror that reduces war to its most brutal essence. Men meet face to face, emerging from behind tree trunks like apparitions. Wild eyes meeting in an instant of mutual recognition of hatred and fear. There is no time to aim. Mosin Nagant and Mauser Kar 98K rifles are fired point blank, flames erupting from the barrels, burning faces, bullets, piercing chests and abdomens in explosions of blood that splatter on the snow like red ink. Bayonets pierce thick coats and find soft flesh, tearing viscera with a wet, nauseating sound. Bodies colliding in the dirty snow in a primal struggle where nails scratch eyes and teeth bite ears. Grenades are thrown into enclosed spaces. German steel hand granates and Soviet F-1s exploding with deafening violence, scattering splinters of wood, bone and metal that pierce multiple bodies in an orgy of destruction. When ammunition runs out, exhausted in desperate bursts, the combat continues in a regression to ancestral barbarity. Trench shovels, mundane tools for digging shelter, become lethal weapons, blades slicing throats with savage blows. Knives emerge from boots, curved blades of melee combat sharpened on icy stones, plunging into ribs with a horrific sucking sound. A German soldier, a Hessian farmer recruited in 1939, and a Soviet, a Donetsk coal miner hardened by the mines, fight on. The frozen ground, rolling among exposed roots and concrete-hard mud, hands tightening around necks, knees crushing groins, until one screams in final agony, the other falls silent, glazed eyes fixed on the canopy of trees blocking the sky. There is no victory, only momentary survival, a stolen breath amidst the chaos, where the victor crawls away, bleeding, knowing that the next encounter could be his end. The cold makes everything even more cruel, a silent torturer that amplifies suffering with sadistic patience. Blood flows and freezes almost instantly, forming black scabs that seal wounds but trap infections, turning cuts into inevitable gangrene. Wounded men who could be saved in another climate, a summer in Ukraine or a spring in Poland, go into shock and die within minutes, their bodies trembling uncontrollably as hypothermia steals vital heat, visions of mothers and distant homes dissolving into feverish delirium. Cries for help echo among the trees, desperate calls in Russian or German lost in the wind, answered only by the indifferent silence of the forest, leaving men agonizing alone, abandoned by comrades who dare not move. The forests are marked by scenes that no one forgets, etched in memory like wounds that never heal. Bodies hanging from low branches, thrown against trunks like broken dolls, half buried in the snow that covers them like a funereal shroud. Helmets scattered on the ground, broken rifles with cracked stocks, gloves abandoned as if their owners had simply evaporated into mist, leaving behind only echoes of truncated lives. The smell of premature decomposition mingles with the resinous pine, a stench that permeates nostrils and souls, evoking the terror of a medieval plague. Officers try to maintain some control, shouting orders through makeshift megaphones or smoke signals, but it's impossible in a labyrinth where communication dissolves. The battle fragments into dozens of small, isolated infernos, each group, perhaps 5 or 6 men, united by loyalty forged in fire, fighting on its own, guided only by primal instinct and the fear that corrodes like acid, turning the brave into cowards and the cowards into beasts. And as night falls, with the sun setting in a bloody twilight that tinges the trees with prophetic red, the forest transforms into something even worse, a realm of darkness where the gloom amplifies everything. The crack of a dry branch sounds like a gunshot, the whisper of the wind like enemy footsteps, a sudden movement like an imminent ambush. Many fire in panic, wasting precious ammunition on illusory shadows, while others wait, motionless as ice statues, holding their breath until their chests ache, listening to approaching footsteps in a crescendo of terror that culminates in explosions of blind violence. At dawn, when the faint light filters through the mutilated canopy, revealing the horror in cruel detail, the forest floor is covered with chaotically scattered bodies, limbs intertwined in deadly embraces, faces contorted into masks of eternal agony. There are no clear lines, no defined boundaries, only silent death among mutilated trees, broken branches pointing to the sky like mute accusations against human madness. The surviving soldiers understand, with a horror that sets in like an incurable disease, that Sinyavino is not just a battle. It is a grinder of men, a merciless machine that crushes bodies and spirits, leaving behind empty shells of beings who once dreamed of peace. And the worst is yet to come, an abyss of despair where terror deepens and war reveals its darkest face, devouring what remains of humanity in an endless cycle of suffering. After days of chaotic fighting, something shifts in the rhythm of the battle. It's not hope, it's not victory, it is pure stubbornness. Even surrounded by the dead, even exhausted, even with frozen feet and trembling hands, the Soviets continued to advance. Not in great waves, not with heroic cries, but in short, painful, almost mechanical steps, metro a metro. Every advancement is paid for in blood. To conquer a single German trench, dozens of men fall. To cross a small stretch of forest, many more are left behind, motionless, covered in snow. Progress is so slow that it barely appears on maps, but on the ground it is marked by bodies lined up like a silent trail. Soldiers no longer attack out of enthusiasm. They attack because stopping means dying right there. The cold bites, hunger gnaws, exhaustion weighs more than the equipment. Men sleep in craters next to frozen corpses, using them as shelter from the wind. Others wake up and realize that their companion next to them died during the night, stiff as stone, eyes open, trapped in the last second of life. Nevertheless, progress continues. Small German positions are taken, a trench here, a shelter there. At some points, the Soviets managed to get dangerously close to the Sinyavino Hills. For brief moments, it seems that the impossible could happen. But every gain brings an immediate response. German artillery punishes any newly conquered position. Machine guns are repositioned. Local counterattacks push the Soviets back, sometimes only a few dozen meters, but those dozens come at a very high cost. Soviet officials are beginning to realize the bitter truth. There is no progress without total sacrifice. Orders keep coming. Advance, always advance, even when there are no more forces, even when there aren't enough men left to form a full platoon. Some soldiers weep as they walk. Others proceed in absolute silence, their gazes vacant as if already dead inside. War is no longer something to be won. Now it is merely something to be endured. When night falls again, the ground gained is minimal, almost insignificant on the map. But on the ground, it is marked by an absurd amount of blood, destroyed equipment, and lives cut short. The survivors are beginning to understand something terrible. They are moving forward, but they are making progress into a trap, and the enemy is already moving to close it. The Germans waited. They always wait. As the Soviets advanced slowly, bleeding with every meter gained, the German command watched with cold, mathematical precision. That painful progress was not a sign of enemy victory. It was exhibition. Soviet lines were stretched too far, poorly connected, with vulnerable flanks and almost non-existent supplies. And then comes the order. German units begin to move silently, using the forests and high ground as cover. It's not a frontal assault. It's something far more dangerous. They advance from the sides. They advance from behind. The clamp begins to close. Suddenly, Soviet positions believed to be in the rear are attacked. Machine guns open fire where before there was only silence. Grenades explode on trails used to transport the wounded and ammunition. Chaos spreads too quickly to be contained. Messengers try to run with warnings, but many don't arrive. Radios fail again. Soviet command realizes too late what is happening. The advanced troops are being surrounded. For the soldiers in the field, the feeling is immediate and terrifying. The fire is now coming from unexpected directions. An attack that should have advanced is beginning to double over. Men look around and no longer see friendly lines, only forest, smoke, and death. The Germans advance with cruel precision. Small groups attack, retreat, reappear at another point. They seek not speed but control. Each movement pushes the Soviets into an ever-shrinking pocket. The terrain favors the executioner. Swamps, forests, and craters impede quick maneuvers. Tanks cannot move. The infantry is too exhausted to break through the encirclement by force. Some Soviet officers try to organize makeshift defenses. Others shout contradictory orders. Some try to advance, some try to retreat, some simply throw themselves to the ground, hoping to survive a few more minutes. And little by little, the truth imposes itself like a punch to the gut. They are no longer attacking. They are in prison. The German pincers continue to close in, meter by meter, like steel jaws. Every Soviet attempt to break through the encirclement is crushed by concentrated fire. Every delay costs more lives. What began as an offensive to save Leningrad now threatens to turn into a mass annihilation. And within this icy pocket, thousands of men are beginning to understand that they may never see their way back again. The net is closing in completely. When the Soviet soldiers finally realize they are surrounded, there are no sirens, no official announcement, only the changing sound of battle. Fire comes from all sides. Supply trails are now corridors of death. The forests, once shelter, transform into invisible walls. Entire units disappear from the map. Battalions that once advanced full of men are now reduced to small, scattered groups, hiding in craters, shallow trenches, or behind broken tree trunks. Many officers are dead. Others have lost all contact with command. Each group is alone. The ammunition is starting to run out. Soldiers count cartridges one by one, saving the last bullet as if it were a talisman. Machine guns fall silent for lack of ammunition. Grenades are rationed like food. Some men carry German rifles taken from corpses, using any weapon that still fires. The cold intensifies even more. Without supplies, without food, without adequate blankets, many begin to lose the fight against. Winter, men tremble uncontrollably, then stop trembling. The most dangerous sign of all. The wounded groan softly so as not to reveal their position, but silence soon takes the place of their voices. Radio stations continue broadcasting pleas for help. We are surrounded. We need ammunition. We cannot back down. Many of these messages never receive a reply. Others receive promises that are never fulfilled. There are no available forces. There are no openings. There are no miracles. The Germans are tightening the noose with cruel patience. They don't attack en masse. They prefer to wear down the enemy. They cut off escape attempts. They eliminate small groups that try to break through the ring. At night, they launch grenades into the surrounded positions just to keep the Soviets awake, exhausted, broken inside. Inside the pocket, time loses its meaning. Days and nights blur together. Men sleep for minutes at a time, wake up startled, pointing weapons at shadows. Some begin to talk to themselves. Others simply sit in the snow, staring into the void, too weak to go on. Even so, there is still resistance. Small Soviet groups organize makeshift defenses. They only fire when the target is clear. They fight no longer for victory, but for dignity. Every hour survived is an affront to the enemy, but reality is unforgiving. Without reinforcements, without supplies, and without an escape route, the fate of these units is sealed. Many know this, and yet they continue fighting. Because, in that icy hell of Sinyavino, giving up doesn't seem like a better option than dying. And as the noose tightens, a difficult decision begins to take shape in the Soviet High Command, a decision that will cost even more lives. The order finally arrives: short, cold, irreversible, retreat. For many Soviet soldiers, that word weighs more than any advance. They fought, suffered, and died to conquer every inch of that terrain. Now they must abandon it, not by choice, but because remaining means total annihilation. The withdrawal begins amidst chaos. There are no organized lines, there are no clean columns. What exists are exhausted men trying to escape a siege that has already closed in too tightly. Small groups move through the forest, stumbling on the snow, dodging craters, following makeshift trails marked by frozen bodies. The Germans realize it immediately. Machine guns open fire on escape routes. Artillery bombards areas where the Soviets are trying to retreat. Each attempt to withdraw becomes a desperate race under crossfire. Men fall, hit in the back without even seeing the enemy. The wounded are abandoned, not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. Many cannot walk. Others beg not to be left behind. Some receive the last bullet from a comrade, a silent gesture to spare them capture, or a slow death in the cold. The land once again exacts its price. Frozen swamps become deadly traps during the hasty escape. Men slip, sink, disappear into the dark water beneath. The broken ice, the weight of their equipment drags bodies down. There is no time to help. Whoever stops dies. In the forest, the horror multiplies. Lost soldiers wander in circles, unsure if they're going in the right direction. Some stumble upon German positions again without realizing it. Others hide for hours, motionless, while enemy patrols pass just a few meters away. The cold transforms the retreat into continuous torture. Men walk until they can no longer feel their feet. When they finally stop, they can no longer stand. Their bodies simply shut down. At dawn, many are found frozen, standing, leaning on rifles like statues of defeat. The floor is covered in abandoned equipment. Rifles, backpacks, helmets, letters that were never sent. Each object tells an interrupted story. Those who managed to break through the encirclement reach the Soviet lines unrecognizable. Beards covered in ice, empty eyes, purple hands, bodies that look older than they actually are. Many don't speak. Others tremble uncontrollably. Some collapse as soon as they realize they are out of enemy range. The withdrawal saves some, but it destroys many others. And when silence returns to the hills of Sinyavino, it brings no relief. It only brings brutal confirmation that that offensive ended in tragedy, but the sacrifice has not yet taken its toll. Because now comes the reckoning, the count of the dead, and an understanding of what was truly lost. When the gunfire finally dies down and the battlefield falls silent, the war is not over. It simply changes shape. In Soviet command posts, officers begin to receive reports. They arrive fragmented, incomplete, often hastily written, stained with mud and blood. Units that once numbered thousands of men now report a few hundred. At most, others simply stop responding. They no longer exist. The numbers are brutal. Entire divisions were crushed. Battalions were wiped off the map in a matter of days. In some sectors, more than half of the men sent never returned. They didn't die in heroic explosions, but frozen, buried, bleeding slowly in forgotten craters. And yet, the siege continues. Leningrad is still isolated. The Noose, the German Noose, remains firm around the starving city. The offensive that was supposed to liberate it failed, not for lack of courage, but because the enemy was entrenched, prepared, and because the terrain and the winter were as lethal as any weapon. For the survivors, defeat doesn't come with speeches. She comes in silence. Soldiers sit around weak campfires, staring at the ground. Many don't speak of the friends they've lost. Others repeat names in hushed voices, as if still hoping to see them emerge from the forest. Some can't sleep without reliving the sound of machine guns and screams trapped in the ice. Doctors do what they can. They treat amputations caused by frostbite. They try to save men who have lost fingers, feet, sometimes entire legs. But they know that many injuries are not visible. There are eyes that no longer shine. There are men who have returned, but not whole. Among the commanders, the reality is even more bitter. They know they sent their men to a hell from which few could escape. They know they miscalculated, underestimated defenses, overestimated forces. And they know that, despite everything, they will have to do it again in the future, because Leningrad still needs to be saved. Sinyavino goes down in history not as a victory, but as a bloody warning, a stark reminder that breaking the siege would cost rivers of blood. And as the snow begins to cover the bodies left behind, one truth becomes evident on all sides. War does not forgive mistakes. She simply charges the price. But even in this devastating failure, something remains alive, something the Germans have yet to manage to kill: Soviet determination, and she will return. As winter deepens and snow once again blankets the hills of Sinyavino, the battlefield seems silent. But that silence is deceptive. Beneath the ice and hard earth lie thousands of bodies. Soldiers who would never return home, men who gave everything in a desperate attempt to save a city they would never see again. Sinyavino was not a victory. There were no flags raised, nor celebrations. There were only survivors, carrying the burden of those left behind. For the Red Army, the battle becomes a lesson written in blood. Mistakes are analyzed, failures are studied. Commanders understand that breaking the siege of Leningrad would require something even greater: better coordination, more artillery, more men, and more sacrifice. But Sinyavino also proves something fundamental: proof that the Soviets, they wouldn't give up. Even in the face of catastrophic losses, even on terrain that seemed cursed, the will to liberate Leningrad remains intact. Every man killed there becomes fuel for future offensives. Every mistake becomes a lesson. Every failure a painful step towards final victory. For the Germans, Sinyavino leaves another message. They won that battle, but at the cost of continuous attrition, exhausted troops, stretched lines, depleted resources. They realize that although they can hold the siege for longer, the enemy before them is relentless and willing to pay any price. Months later, new offensives would emerge, more coordinates, more brutal, more effective. And finally, the siege of Leningrad would be broken. But before that, there was Sinyavino, a name that doesn't appear prominently in textbooks, but echoes like a dark whisper in the history of war. A frozen nightmare where ordinary men faced the impossible, not for glory, but out of necessity. Sinyavino was the place where the Red Army bled, fell, and learned. And Leningrad, even though still chained at that moment, survived thanks to the men who died trying to free her. This is Sinyavino's true legacy. Not immediate victory, but it proves that even in the hell of ice and steel, human resilience can refuse to die.